So continuing with our lecture, now we have this kind of map or guideline of how to collect data, because as I mentioned, the objective of this lecture is to understand how to collect data. So this process starts with choosing the sampling method and choosing the sample. I will explain what's that in a second. From there, we move to identify the variables. This is the ideal kind of way or order, because sometimes we start from here because there is, I don't know, that is where the inspiration comes from, and then we move to the sample. But let's assume that we start from the ideal, which is starting with the sampling method, then we move to the variables, then we choose how to collect the data, we choose the collection methods. We're going to talk about that later. And then theory, or even the book, says that the ideal is to conduct a pilot study to check if what we plan actually works. But to be honest, in a thesis, you don't have much time. So usually you don't do this, or you do it super quick. And then later you collect the data. So we can say that we're going to analyze more or less these four if we ignore this, because this is literally just trial and error, and mini test, pilot study. So let's start with the sampling method. And to understand what is a sample, I need to explain you two important concepts. First, what is a population and what is a sample? So in quantitative research, we assume that we want to find something, right? Discovering that, you know that from the previous lecture. We think that the answer to our research question is there, but we want to find it, to discover it. We don't want to interpret, that's the other paradigm, we just want to discover. So because of that, we always assume that we want to study a population. So the population, the definition of the population is a group of people, or it can be a collection of items that you analyze, and this, or that you want to study. And something very important, this is a must, it must not exclude anyone or anything. So here is a quick example from football. So if you want to study Premier League players, the population is everyone in the Premier League, right? Everyone. You can't exclude a single player, okay? So that will be your population, because you want to study Premier League players. What happens if you want to study football players in general? Then your population will be every football player in the world. And then it is tricky, right? Because if you just mention football players, then should you include amateur football players? Or should you include only professional football players, or only leagues that belong to FIFA? Then it gets more complicated, right? So the population is what you want to study, everything, not excluding anything. But it is a challenge to study everything, right? Like imagine, as I said, studying every football player in the world, amateurs, professionals, and everyone. That is such a huge challenge, right? So in order to study them, what we can do for practical reasons is to only study a sample. A sample is a subset of the population. So imagine if you have all the players in this group, the subset will be only one section, or one piece of these football players. So for example, in here, if you want to study Premier League players, then you can pick up your sample will be only some players from the Premier League. And there are some things that are very important when you define your population and sample. So this is the next thing. So the first thing that you need to do in a quantitative study is to choose the correct population. As I mentioned, if you said, I want to study football players like that, then you need to make it clear if you include amateurs or professional football players. That is defining the correct population. So here are some tips for you to define the correct population. So first, make sure that the studied population is coherent with your research objective. So for example, if your research question is, I want to study the impact of the amount that players receive their salaries, when the impact of the salary in the football performance. So in that case, then your population should contain only professional football players, right? Because they get paid. So that then in that sense, you need to make sure that your population is coherent. Then you also need to prepare to justify your choice. In your thesis or in your research paper, you should be able to convince the reader really quickly why that's your population. In that case, for example, if your research question is about salaries and performance, it should be easy to justify why your population is professional players and not players in general. And then this is something important, like in practice, the correct population is heavily influenced not only by your research question, but also by practical limitations. So be honest on what you can achieve. Like, again, if you want to study every professional food player in the world, that's really challenging. So narrow your question, so then you can make it coherent with the population that you are picking up. It's kind of a tricky thing, like reflect on your question and then go and see if that population is reachable or if you have access to that, and then just keep iterating, fix the question, fix the population, and like that. That's how it works in practice, because the book says like obey your research question blindly, but it doesn't work like that. And then maybe let's assume that maybe you end up saying like, we're going to analyze the impact of salaries on the performance of football players in Sweden. So then you know your population is professional football players in Sweden. So probably you have 1, 2, 3 divisions. I don't know how many professional divisions are here. And then you also have women and men. And that's also another thing that you need to explain. So let's assume women and men, both genders. But it's still a challenge, right? To do a survey or to collect data from all the all the football players in Sweden. So in order to study your population, what you can do and what you should do is to choose a sample. So choosing a sample is something very important, because then if you can study only a subset of your whole population, then it is easier, and sometimes then it's finally possible, because then you have the resources to study at least one sample. So the first thing that I want to tell you is that when you choose the sample, kind of a must is that that sample has to be randomly selected, right? Like there are some cases where you can choose who is going to be in your sample, but in 99% of the cases, once that you have agreed on your population, you should select a random sample. And that random sample needs to obey to these two things: that it is totally randomly sampled, like for example, you don't purposely exclude one player because you don't like him or something like that. And the other thing is that you need to have a like a process of randomized messing up with the word, but you need to have a process to make your sample random. Like for instance, a very simple way to make something random, to find to randomize a sample, is to go in Excel and use the command random. I think it's RAND. And with that, you can randomize, they can give you a random number. And you can, for example, say 1, 0, and random between 1 and 0. And so it will be 50-50% that you get 1 or 0. So then in mind that you have your data set of 100 observations, then maybe 1 or 0, you apply that, and maybe 1 means you include that observation, 0 that you exclude it. So that can be a possibility. So for example, if you already have the list of all the players in Sweden, then you can do that 1 or 0 in your list. And then whoever got 0, you don't include him or her in your study. And if it got 1, then you include it. So then you are kind of sampling 50% of the population randomly. So that's a good strategy to do it. So that is one way to approach that, because sometimes you don't even have access to the whole population. So it's the other way around. You only have access to the sample. And what you want to show is that that sample represents the population. That's another strategy. We're going to talk about that later on. So until here, let me quickly summarize this video. Remember, we have population, it's important to define the population, and the sample is a subset of the population. So there are some tricks or some procedures to define your population. And finally, it is important that your sample is random. That is not that you are doing sampling on purpose or with a bias. So this is it until now. In the next video, we're going to continue with sampling.